gospel reading this morning is from Luke chapter 14. We're going to read the first verse, and then we're going to read verses 7 through 14. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. When he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, give this person your place. And then in disgrace you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He said also to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. And you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Christian Herter was a former governor of Massachusetts. Now, when he was active governor, he was aggressively campaigning for re-election. He had a particularly grueling day, and he hadn't had anything to eat since he got up that morning. He had one more appointment. It was at a hotel where he was to give a campaign speech, and they were going to have dinner. Now, when Governor Herter arrived there, they were serving a buffet-style dinner. So he grabbed his plate eagerly and got in line. When he got to where the main course, the chicken, was being put on a plate, there was a woman behind the table with tongs to put a piece of chicken on everybody's plate. As she put the piece on Governor Herter's plate, he said, ma'am, I'm really hungry. Would you go ahead and put another piece of chicken on there? Well, the lady tactfully replied, I'm sorry, sir, there's enough for everyone in the line, but you are welcome to come up for seconds when you're done. Well, that wasn't good enough for Christian Herter. He said, ma'am, I'm sorry, but I'm really famished. I haven't had anything to eat all day. I really need that other piece of chicken now. She again said, sir, I'm sorry, but when everyone in the line has been served, you can come up at the rear of the line and get chicken again. Well, Governor Herter wasn't going to take no for an answer. He looked the lady in the eye. He said, look, do you know who I am? I'm the governor of the state. This whole affair is put on for me. The lady looked Governor Herter back in the eye and she said, sir, do you know who I am? I'm the lady in charge of the chicken. Now move along. Governor Herter was a cat person. Now, I don't mean by that he preferred cats as pets, but I'm talking in regard to everyone's attitudes can be broken into two different types of categories. Those like dogs and those like cats. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, have you ever noticed the master of the house comes home, and the dog comes rushing up to the master, and the master pats him on the head, and the dog's tail's just wagging, and he's licking his hand and looking up at the master adoringly and thinking, oh, he must be some sort of god. But the master sits down in his chair, and in a little while the cat jumps up on the armrest. And the master scratches the cat's ears, and the cat just folds its legs in and hunkers down and closes its eyes and begins to softly purr and is saying to itself, I must be some sort of a god. Cat people and dog people. And Christian Herter was a cat person. Now in our reading this morning, the gospel reading, Jesus went to dinner with a whole bunch of cat people. Each one of them thought of themselves as so important they must be some sort of god. And they were jostling for position of honor at the dinner table. Jesus observed that, and that's what prompted him to give them the lesson that he did. But that lesson shouldn't have been new to them. It had been around a long time. It was written in their Old Testament. For example, in Proverbs chapter 25, 6 and 7, it says, "Do not put yourself forward in the presence of the king, nor stand in the place of the great. Better to be told, 'Come up here,' than to be put lower in the presence of a noble." It was sound advice. Very good advice. But apparently these Pharisees hadn't learned their lesson. Humility. At least act humble. At least act humble. It'll make you look civilized, at the very least. But it's really more, it's more important to be humble than just act humble. For example, there was a pastor. He was there on Sunday morning. It was long before the service started. And he came under conviction. He went into the sanctuary alone, and he walked up to the altar. He knelt at the altar, and he began to beat his breast and say, "Lord, I am nothing." Well, in a few minutes, the minister of music came in. She wanted to prepare for rehearsals before the service, and she saw the pastor up there. So she came up and she knelt at his right-hand side and began to join in the prayer. They're both up there praying, "Lord, I am nothing." And the minister of education poked his head in a little bit later because he couldn't find the other ministers. He sees them both up at the altar, kneeling in prayer. He comes up and kneels at the left side of the pastor, and he joins in their prayer. "Lord, I am nothing." The three of them up there, nothing. The custodian of the church comes into the sanctuary looking for his dust rag, and he sees the three ministers up there at the front, and he hears this prayer of humility. So he bows his head humbly, and he walks up and kneels down next to the minister of music and joins in the prayer. When the pastor hears the custodian's voice, he looks up and looks over at the custodian, and he looks over at the minister of education, raises his eyebrow and says, "Hey, look who thinks he's nothing." No. True humility is essential. Let me tell you about a really humble man. A hero of our nation, so to speak, a folk legend, as it were. George Washington Carver. Now, George Washington Carver was a brilliant academic. But he was a black man at a time in this country when black people were treated very unfairly. However, he distinguished himself so that he was appointed the head of the agricultural department at the prestigious Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Now, one day, Mr. Carver was on his way to school. He was walking along the road, and he was passing through a rather well-to-do neighborhood. A white woman stuck her head out her door and saw George Washington Carver. She said, "Hey, boy, you want to make a quarter? I've got some wood that needs to be chopped." Mr. Carver stopped and looked at the woman and smiled. He took off his jacket. He rolled up his sleeves. He went around to her backyard and he began to chop wood. When he finished chopping it, he stacked it in his arms and he took it in and laid it by her fireplace, and he had to make a few trips because he had stacked a lot of wood. After he was done, he put his jacket back on, he smiled at the lady again and bid her good day, and he started back down that road. Now, there was a child in the house that had recognized George Washington Carver as the head of the agricultural department at the school, and she told the lady of the house. When the lady discovered that, she was mortified. The next day, she went down to the school. She found Mr. Carver's office. She went in. She began to apologize profusely for her behavior for the day before. Once again, George Washington Carver smiled at her. And he said, "Ma'am, think nothing of it. On occasion, I enjoy a little manual labor. And besides that, it's always a delight to do something for my friends." Now, he wasn't being facetious. He wasn't being sarcastic. He had no ulterior motive in taking that tat. George Washington Carver was being George Washington Carver. He was exercising the inner humility that just added that much more greatness to the man. He so endeared himself to that woman through his demeanor that a couple of weeks later, the school received a donation of several $1,000s that had come from not only that woman, but her friends who she had talked in to going in with her on this donation to the school. True humility. It's essential. How do we develop such humility? Well, Jesus gives us some good guidance in the matter. In the Sermon on the Plain, Jesus said, "But if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you hope to receive back, what credit is that to you? For even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much back. But love your enemies. Do good and lend, hoping for nothing in return. And your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for He is kind to the unthankful and evil. Therefore be merciful, just as your Father also is merciful." He went on to say, "Do not judge, you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will be put into your bosom. With the same measure that you use, it will be measured back to you." Practical application of humility. That's what Jesus is talking about. Practical application of humility. Andrew Murray was a South African pastor at the turn of the 20th century. I think that his definition for humility is one of the best things I've ever heard. What Andrew said was, humility is perfect quietness of heart. It is to expect nothing. It is to wonder at nothing that is done to me. It is to feel nothing done against me. It is to be at rest when people don't praise me, when I am blamed or persecuted. It is having a blessed home in the Lord, where I can go in and shut the door and kneel to my Father in secret and am at peace as if in a deep sea of calmness, while all around and above is trouble. Humility. Have you ever thought about it in those terms? That sounds wonderful, doesn't it? It sounds like a wonderful state of mind to be able to rely on, to count on in the midst of what we have to face each and every day. But it's not reserved for the George Washington Carvers of the world. It's not reserved for great men and women. It's available to each and every one of us who trust in Jesus Christ. All we have to do is turn ourselves over and be flexible to His guidance, to be the clay in the potter's hand, and allow Him to shape us with the pressure of His touch, applied with design, applied in accordance with what He envisions us becoming. Even though we don't understand what's going on in ourselves, He does. And if we stay pliable in His hand, then He can turn us in to the masterpiece that He has envisioned each and every one of us becoming. It's there for the taking. In the name of the Father, and the Son,